Great to be here with you guys. So I'm an economist by training. I'm going to start with a little bit of economic history. This is the world that we are leaving. This is the world of rich countries and poor countries, okay? And this is a little bit, to my mind, the watermark of the difference between rich countries and poor countries. We have two graphs here. One represents SME, small, medium enterprise contribution to GDP, and the other one, small, medium enterprise SME contribution to employment. Now, first of all, we all know that there's a huge difference between SMEs and entrepreneurship, and I'll get to that in a moment. But these are the data that we have. And what you see is that in rich countries, a large share of both GDP and employment is constituted by small firms, small and medium firms, which is going to include rapidly growing firms. Whereas in poor countries, a very large share of GDP and a significant share of employment is owned by informal business, by businesses that really aren't even at the starting point to grow, okay? So I'm going to get back to this, but this notion of the missing middle is something that policy and organizations like Endeavor have been directly created to address. Why don't we have more, first of all, overall startup firms or young firms, growing firms, but particularly among those firms, those high growth firms that really transform the economy. So that's just kind of a data prelude that I want to put in the background. Now, there's been a lot of talk in the last few years. I've been tracking this work on regional growth and entrepreneurship for quite a long time. But in the last few years, there's been a lot of talk about ecosystems. So my colleagues and I at the Kauffman Foundation just recently started to think about what would happen if we took this really pretty seriously, not just as a metaphor, but a model, okay? So my number one sort of takeaway conceptually for you today is that you hear a lot about sectors in the economy, right? You might hear about the energy sector, health, telecommunications, different sectors of the economy. Well, I'm saying basically you can forget all about that, okay? There's only one sector in the economy, and that's the forest sector, okay? The forest sector is the only sector in the economy. Now, what does the forest sector look like? Well, from the sky, let's say in the United States, from the sky, you look down and you see GE and Exxon, right? Now you see Google. And that's the canopy. And when you look down at the economy, the big trees are essentially all that you see. And it's easy to believe, certainly it's easy for policymakers, the general public, to believe that that's the entire economy. But of course, you know, any of us who've been in a forest, we know that although the canopy is very dominant when we look from afar, when we actually walk in the rainforest, when we actually walk down the street, right, what we actually see is a lot of small firms. We see a lot of small trees, right? And all that scrub that's kind of at eye level, all those businesses that you see along the street, all those other human beings doing things, producing services for us, they also have a lot of biomass, right? In the United States, it's about 47% of the economy is small business under 250 employees. What makes for a vibrant ecosystem, however, is that middle sector, right? So when we talk about the missing middle, that's the middle right there. That's the growth sector. That's small that becomes big, okay? So how does that happen? Well, this is one of the ways that it happens. The old dies, okay? Any of us who've ever been in a rainforest, we're familiar with this picture. This is part of life in an organic place. The old dies, and then what happens? The new grows out of the old. And what makes for a vibrant ecosystem, what makes for a vibrant rainforest, what makes for a vibrant economy is the capacity to reconfigure the nutrients that are released when the old dies into something of equal or greater value. Now, of course, the ecosystem doesn't put judgments on this. We're human beings, though, and we have to see new value created out of the old that rewards us in some way, right? That's what value means to human beings. So when we think about economies that are stuck, economies that are poor, it's actually overwhelmingly this inability, this incapacity of the economy to convert nutrients into higher valued uses. And that's often not because the people, in fact, it's almost without exception, not because people don't have the capacity to do it. It's because institutionally, those large trees Many countries in the past, it's been large state-owned enterprises, heavily subsidized, that are fundamentally inefficient, are not allowed to fall over and release the resources that could be available to entrepreneurs, whether it's in forms of contracts or in form of employees. So part of what I'm going to be talking about later on when I get to the end of this talk is some of the policy implications that come of this. Now, we have been doing some actual research about this at the Kauffman Foundation. And this research comes in sort of two parts. And by the way, this is brand new. This is a report. This particular report I'm mentioning, the first part of it is something that I authored that's at Kauffman.org. It's a Kauffman Foundation working paper. I'm also going to make reference to another report authored by my colleague, Dane Stangler. And this is both research papers of the Kauffman Foundation. Now, the one that I've just released is called Enabling Entrepreneurial Ecosystems. And what we've done in this paper is we've actually drawn from the literature in ecology. Now, a century ago, there was quite a bit of interest among economists in biological models. Herbert Spencer was an economist of the late 19th century, and for an interval, he was more widely read than Adam Smith among economists. That moment passed. Alfred Marshall, who was really one of the greats of economists, set the foundations. He talked about biology as the mecca of economists. And he lamented the fact that he didn't have, Billy, the apparatus, the theoretical apparatus, to make use of the insights of biology and of ecology. But what's happened is in the last century, biology and ecology have actually advanced considerably. And there are models of evolutionary biology. There are mathematical models of the origins of life. And so we actually, as economists, have a very rich research literature to appeal to now. So what does this say here? Well, in an ecological ecosystem, there's an initial phase of exploitation. Now, you can think about this, an ecosystem, as a region, and you can think about it as a market. And actually, this description works in sort of both ways, okay? So in the initial phase, that's exploitation phase in the bottom left, it's sort of wide open field. It's after the tree has fallen. There's space in the canopy, and the new grows, and all of those new sprouts. I mean, it's really very exciting after a fire or after a big storm in the forest, and you see how all the new is competing for the sunlight, right? Well, we see this in the economy too. And why do we have so much emphasis on the digital space in so many places around the world? Yes, it's because digital technologies are extremely powerful, but the other reason is they're not owned by any incumbent business interests. We don't see nearly as many innovators around the world in fertilizer and in cement. It's not because these companies and these industries can't benefit from entrepreneurship and can't benefit from improvements in efficiency, but it's because they're locked up by incumbent business interests that simply will not allow new entry, whereas digital markets allow that. And so that's part of why we've seen in this bottom phase the exploitation. So Matt Ridley kind of talks about this as the sort of phase where ideas have sex, and all of this sort of ferment is going on. Now, Stelly used a word in his talk. I can't remember. It was a word he kept repeating. But in any event, it sort of links to this conservation stage where we get to climax. Okay? So the prelude is we have the ideas are having sex, then we get to this phase climax. Now, what climax means in an ecology is that everything is at sort of maximal complexity. Okay? And so when we think about like Silicon Valley is definitely in that stage, but it's not just Silicon Valley. There's all kinds of entrepreneurial ecosystems in economies that actually are in this stage of sort of a maximum connectedness. But down here on the bottom right-hand corner is a very important part, release. This is when there is a collapse, a failure of the ecosystem, right? And this is often considered to be a disastrous situation when all of the businesses and all of the models that were successful collapse in on themselves. That's actually, as we all know, first of all, an inherent part of the vital functioning of an ecosystem, but it's also a moment of tremendous opportunity. And then there's this phase of reorganization and retrenchment, and then we go back into exploitation. So now separately, Dane Stangler and Jordan Del Masterson have come out with this working paper titled Measuring an Entrepreneurial Ecosystem. And so there's some metrics that they have proposed. And basically in every case here, these are considered to be positive. So density, just how much activity is there. Fluidity, how much flow is there in the ecosystem. Connectivity, and we can really think about connectivity in a pretty sophisticated way, as I'm going to show in the next slide. So to what extent are the actors connected, and how are they connected, and how can we benchmark that against regions where we know there's been a lot of success? And finally, diversity is very important. Okay, so the diversity of actors, diversity of industry, and each of these are measurable on a region-by-region level. So what we've done in this next slide that looks exactly, really, in terms of the model as the one I showed previously, is actually map these in the sense of sort of some initial conjectures, not in the sense of findings, because we're just at the beginning of really implementing this framework and starting to gather the data on a region-by-region, market-by-market basis, but some initial conjectures as to what these actual metrics might look like at each stage in the ecosystem. And what this will allow us to do as we sort of roll it out is to do more than go into an ecosystem and say, you know, we have a lot of energy here, there's a lot of events, we see some good exits, we see fluidity, we see mentorship, but actually get some metrics and some numbers around how the ecosystem's evolving and how it's actually able to do this thing that I was talking about earlier, reconfigure assets into new value in a consistent way. Okay? Now, one dimension of that is a project that's being led by our Endeavor partner in the Global Entrepreneurship Research Network. And this is a project to map 100 cities in 5 years. We're 1 year in, and they have 20 cities signed up. And this is Rhett Morris at Endeavor Insight who's leading this. And the notion is basically this is the connectivity piece. But what we want to do with the connectivity piece is link it back to this model. And this is a map of Cairo. You guys have seen many maps like this, relational maps, mentor investment, founder, former employees, inspiration. And they've done this work to map the ecosystem. What we want to do is take this and really make it operational. Okay, so finally, just in my last couple of minutes, I wanted to talk about what that last panel was referring to, the role of policy and government, and also private foundations or organizations that really, like Startup Istanbul, are actually trying to enable entrepreneurial ecosystems, trying to do something positive. Okay? Now, we know actually that this can work. I mean, one of the really great examples we have is from San Diego. And San Diego went through, so San Diego is just south of Los Angeles. It was a Navy town for many years, for about a century. It was really defined by the presence of a naval mission there. But they had repeated recessions as a consequence of cuts in government funding. And this happened in the early 1980s. That's what this quote is about, and the community got together at that point, and they said, what is it that we can do so that we're not as vulnerable to these disruptions? And what they did was, and Mary Walshock, who wrote this for a case for my journal, was they really brought the community together about the possibilities for biotechnology. She says, in my experience working in a community that completely reinvented itself over a 30-year period suggests that accelerating entrepreneurship is as much about community transformation as it is about helping individual entrepreneurs. So it's a great case study as to how this can happen. So just really quickly, six lessons, particularly for government in this case, okay? So my number one thing, I mean, you guys are a bunch of entrepreneurs, so I'm not going to stress this that much, but if I ever have a chance to speak in front of people at the World Bank or the U.S. Agency for National Development or any national governments, I will always say, number one thing, favor incumbents less. It does no good to set up a fund. Let's set up a $100 million fund, a $50 million fund, seed stage fund for our entrepreneurs. We're even going to have the Prime Minister come in and cheer some entrepreneurs. When 9/10 of your funding, 9/10 of your policies are about supporting incumbent firms and making it difficult for entrepreneurs to compete. If you close market spaces through 9/10 of government policies to entrepreneurs, then the 1/10 that you do in $50 million funds is just simply not going to change the game. So the number one thing is favor incumbents less. Number two thing is listen to entrepreneurs. Before you do something to help entrepreneurs, go in a room like this, talk to people, find out what their actual reality is. And in every place, every part of the world, every community in the United States, it's going to be different. Sometimes radically different, sometimes slightly different. But obviously they should be listening to entrepreneurs. Third is map the ecosystem. So then do something systematic. After you've just listened, we're trying to do this at the Kauffman Foundation. But you know, the government can also sort of get some of the best research. The fourth is, again, learning from entrepreneurs. I mean, this is an old entrepreneurial, where there's different versions of this, but think big, start small, move fast. Government can do the same thing. It's difficult, but they can do that. Avoid artificially segmenting your community or your strategies. So don't do one thing for investors, one thing for entrepreneurs, and think that they're different people. As we well know, they're all the same people. We're all one community. People change roles all the time. Government has a very hard time thinking that way, because they think people have jobs. And so you're an entrepreneur, so you can't be an investor, you can't be a mentor. That's ridiculous. So, and then finally, my last point, prepare to capitalize on crises. And that goes back to what I was saying about San Diego and the reorganization of the nutrients in the economy. So anyway, I hope that's of some value. Glad to talk to you guys afterwards.